Before this story begins, do one thing for me. Close your eyes for just a moment and remember. Remember that time someone spoke over you in a meeting as if your voice didn't exist. Remember when they looked past you, through you, around you, but never at you. Remember the weight that settled in your chest when you realized that to them, you were furniture. Decoration. Background noise in the symphony of their own importance. If you've ever been ignored, underestimated, spoken over, or treated like you didn't belong in the room, this story is for you. This isn't just a story. This is a mirror, and what you're about to see reflected back might make you uncomfortable. It might make you angry. It might make you remember things you've tried to forget. Good. So take a second right now. Hit subscribe, tap like, and when this story ends, when the final word lands and the silence returns, I want you to comment one word that describes how it made you feel. Because what you're about to hear isn't just entertainment. It's not a fairy tale with easy answers and convenient villains. It's a reminder that silence is not weakness, that stillness is not surrender, and that the people you overlook today, the ones you dismiss with a glance, the ones whose names you never bother to learn, may be the very people who decide your future tomorrow. Now listen closely, because every word matters. They were already laughing when she arrived. Not the kind of laughter that comes from joy. Not the belly-deep sound of genuine amusement that makes your eyes water and your chest ache. This was different. This was the laughter of men who had already decided they'd won. The kind of sound that lives in the back of the throat, barely escaping through teeth that remain mostly closed. It was the laughter of certainty, of dominance, of men who believed the outcome was decided before the first word was spoken. The private dining room sat at the very top of the Kensington Tower, 47 floors above the street, sealed away from the chaos and noise of the city below. This was not a room you stumbled into. This was not a place where reservations were made by ordinary people with ordinary problems. The entrance alone required 3 separate security clearances, 2 private elevators, and the kind of credit card that didn't have a visible limit. Everything about the space screamed exclusivity. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the city sprawling in every direction like a constellation of ambition. The lighting was soft, deliberately engineered to make everyone look powerful and composed. Recessed fixtures cast a warm glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The table itself was a single piece of mahogany, polished until it reflected every movement like a dark mirror, showing you not just who you were but who you wanted others to see. This was not a place for mistakes. This was where billion-dollar decisions were finalized. Where money changed hands with a handshake and a signature. Where empires expanded or contracted based on the confidence in a man's voice. Where power didn't just show its face, it settled in, ordered the most expensive wine, and spoke without ever being interrupted. 3 men sat on one side of the table. They had arrived early. Strategy. It gave them time to claim the space, to settle into their chairs with the kind of ease that suggested ownership. Their suits were impeccable, tailored in Milan, pressed that morning, worn with the casual confidence of men who owned many just like them. Their posture was relaxed but deliberate. Jackets still buttoned, phones face down on the table but positioned close enough to reach without effort. They spoke in that particular cadence of men who were used to being listened to, their words flowing with the assumption that interruption was impossible. Across from them sat the woman they had come to see. She did not rush into the room. She did not announce herself with grand gestures or loud greetings. She did not perform her entrance for their benefit. She simply appeared. One moment the seat was empty. The next, she was there, settling into her chair with the kind of quiet precision that suggested she had done this 1,000 times before. Her presence was immediate but not loud, substantial but not overwhelming, and she said nothing. Her silence was immediate and total, and it bothered them immensely. Dr. Yuki Matsuda was not unknown to the world. She was the founder and CEO of Cairo Medical Technologies, one of the most valuable private technology firms outside North America. For 15 years, she had built her company slowly, carefully, without shortcuts or compromises. Hospitals across 3 continents relied on her diagnostic systems. Surgeons trusted her surgical robotics with human lives. Her patents were cited in thousands of research papers. Her name appeared on innovation lists, diversity panels, and industry retrospectives. But tonight, in this room, With these men, none of that mattered. Because what they saw was not an accomplished engineer, not a respected CEO, not a woman who had built something extraordinary from nothing. What they saw was a woman who did not speak. And in their silence-fearing, dominance-obsessed world, they decided what that meant. It meant weakness. It meant uncertainty. It meant opportunity. Long flight. One of them asked, his smile thin and sharp as a paper cut. "Doctor." Matsuda looked at him with dark, steady eyes. She nodded once. Polite, measured, minimal, no words. The man's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at his colleagues, and something passed between them. A look, an understanding. The kind of wordless communication that men like this perfected in boardrooms and country clubs and private offices where women weren't invited. Another leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. He adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, understated, expensive, and spoke with the careful tone of someone addressing a child or a confused tourist. "We'll try to keep this simple," he said, each word landing with patronizing precision. "I know these meetings can get complicated, technical. We don't want to overwhelm you with jargon." The third man nodded, adding warmth to his voice like sugar dissolving in poison. "We're here to make this easy, smooth, mutually beneficial." They smiled again. Those smiles. Doctor. Matsuda listened. She did not flinch, did not bristle, did not react in any visible way. Her hands remained folded on the table in front of her. Her expression remained neutral, not cold but carefully blank, the way a still lake reveals nothing of the depth beneath. She simply existed in her silence, and her silence said more than they could hear. At the far end of the room, moving quietly between chairs and glassware with practiced, nearly invisible steps, was someone the men had not acknowledged even once. Her name was Naomi Clark. She wore the standard uniform, black slacks, white button-down shirt, a simple black apron tied at the waist. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, not a strand out of place. Her movements were economical, efficient, the result of years learning how to navigate spaces where your presence was required but your visibility was not. She had learned, long ago, how to be invisible. It was part of the job description, though they never wrote it down. The real requirement wasn't just serving food or pouring wine or clearing plates. It was learning to disappear, to become part of the background, to exist as a function rather than a person. She refilled water glasses without being asked, adjusted the placement of plates with millimeter precision, cleared used napkins before anyone noticed they were crumpled. She moved through the room like a ghost, and the men never once looked at her face. But she heard everything, every pause, every tone, every sentence spoken just a little louder than necessary, projected not for communication but for dominance. The men began talking numbers, market penetration, quarterly projections, expansion timelines, revenue optimization. They spoke fast, their words tumbling over each other with the practiced fluency of people who had given this pitch before, who knew exactly which phrases inspired confidence and which ones obscured risk. They spoke as if the outcome was already decided, as if they were narrating a done deal rather than proposing one. "Your technology is impressive," one said, his tone managing to sound both complimentary and dismissive. "But you've hit a ceiling, a natural plateau. What you need, what Cairo needs, is infrastructure, scale, access to markets you simply can't reach on your own." Another nodded, jumping in smoothly. "We're offering you the opportunity to take your work global, to have real impact. Isn't that what every innovator wants? Legacy." The third leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into something more intimate, more conspiratorial. "Between us, Drive, Matsuda, there are bigger players circling. If you don't move now, you'll lose the chance to control your own narrative. We're giving you the best deal you're going to see." When Dr. Matsuda finally responded, she did so in a calm, measured voice. Speaking Japanese, her words flowed with quiet authority, each syllable precise and deliberate. Beside her, a young man in his late 20s, her assistant, Kenji Tanaka, translated into English. His voice was professional, neutral, carefully stripped of emotion. "Dr. Matsuda would like to understand the specific terms regarding operational authority post-acquisition." Short sentences, neutral tone, nothing that revealed what she actually thought. The men nodded, barely listening. One of them waved his hand dismissively, as if brushing away an annoying insect. Standard language, he said quickly. All the usual protections and provisions. We can walk through the details, but really, this is boilerplate. Another man reached for his wine glass, taking a slow sip before adding, the important thing is the vision. The partnership. The details always work themselves out. Under the table, hidden from view, one man's leg bounced impatiently. Another checked his watch. Patek Philippe, vintage, worth more than most people's cars. Doctor. Matsuda asked another question in Japanese. Kenji translated. She would like clarification on intellectual property rights retention. One man actually sighed, not loudly, but audibly enough to be intentional. She doesn't say much, does she? He whispered to the colleague beside him, his voice just barely low enough to maintain plausible deniability. The other replied with a slight smirk, maybe she doesn't fully grasp the scale of what we're offering. They thought they were being subtle. They weren't. Doctor. Matsuda's expression did not change. She did not react to their whispers. Her eyes remained steady, fixed on the middle distance, as if she were looking through them rather than at them. Her hands stayed folded. Her silence continued, but there was something different now. A quality to her stillness that hadn't been there before. Like a held breath. Like the moment before thunder. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. She understood every word they'd spoken, both the official ones and the whispered ones. She had learned Japanese 15 years ago, during a different life. A life before this uniform, before these invisible hours, before she learned that speaking 3 languages fluently meant nothing if you were serving someone else's dinner. She had learned it in Tokyo, during 2 years teaching English, living in a tiny apartment in Shibuya, navigating a world where she was seen as foreign but never less than human. She had learned the language in a place where her silence was respected, not mistaken for ignorance. And now she stood in this room, watching silence be weaponized against someone else. The first course arrived, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops on a bed of microgreens, artfully positioned on pristine white plates. Naomi served each person with careful precision, placing plates in front of them without a sound. None of them looked at her. None of them said thank you. The men spoke more freely now. Wine had loosened their restraint. The first bottle was empty, and a second was being opened. Confidence made them careless. They were winning. They could feel it, and winning made them generous with their truths. One of them leaned back, his chair tilting dangerously, and laughed softly. You know, he said, gesturing with his fork, this would move along much faster if we had a bit more back and forth. Some real dialogue. Another added, his tone dripping with false sympathy, some people prefer to let others do the talking. Different cultures, different communication styles. We respect that. They smiled again. Those same smiles. Doctor. Matsuda took a slow sip of water. The glass touched her lips. She swallowed. She set it down with deliberate care, the base meeting the table without sound. She said nothing, but something shifted in the room. Naomi noticed it immediately. A slight pause in Dr. Matsuda's breathing, a microsecond of hesitation before her hand returned to her lap. The kind of moment that comes before a decision, the space between seeing and acting, between staying silent and speaking up. Naomi returned to the service station at the edge of the room, her hands steady despite the trembling she felt inside. Her mind raced through possibilities, consequences, all the ways this could go wrong. She had been taught, from her first day, to keep quiet. To do her job, to stay in her place. You're part of the atmosphere, her manager had told her during training. You enhance the experience without disrupting it. You're here to serve, not to participate. Remember that, and you'll define. She had remembered. For 3 years, she had remembered. But she also knew what happened when silence was misunderstood. When quietness was mistaken for permission. When stillness was interpreted as submission. She'd lived it. The men opened a leather folder, the contract inside printed on heavy cream-colored paper with raised letterhead. They spoke confidently, pointing to sections, flipping pages with casual authority. This protects everyone involved, one said, tapping a paragraph with his index finger. Your technology, our infrastructure, mutually beneficial terms. Clean, simple, fair. Dr. Matsuda asked a question in Japanese. Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge now. A sharpness that hadn't been there before. Kenji translated. She would like clarification on the clause regarding long-term authority after acquisition. Specifically, who maintains decision-making power over product development? The man waved his hand again, that same dismissive gesture. Standard language. Nothing unusual. You retain advisory capacity, we take operational control. That's how these partnerships work. He smiled. That smile. Naomi froze mid-movement, a water pitcher suspended in her hand. She knew that wasn't true. She had heard language like that before, years ago, when her father lost his restaurant. The investors had used the same words. Standard language, nothing unusual, mutually beneficial. They had smiled the same way. And within 6 months, her father's name was off the building, his recipes were changed, and he was forbidden from opening another restaurant within 50 miles. Words designed to sound harmless. Clauses designed to take everything. The men leaned closer together, their voices dropping into that intimate register men use when they think they're among allies. This really shouldn't be difficult, one said. We're offering stability, growth, security. In today's market, that's not something to take lightly. Another chuckled, the sound dry and humorless. Most people would be grateful for an opportunity like this. It's not every day someone offers to take your little company and turn it into something truly significant. Little company. Dr. Matsuda's eyes lowered, just for a moment, but in that moment, Naomi saw something she recognized. The weight of being diminished, the exhaustion of being underestimated, the quiet rage of watching people decide who you were without ever asking. The room felt heavier now. The air itself seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Dr. Matsuda spoke again. This time, her words were different. Softer, more human, not meant for formal translation or public record. She spoke in Japanese, almost to herself, the words barely above a whisper. Koko ni wa, dare mo inai no ka, dare mo kizut inai no ka. Is there no one here who sees what's happening? Does no one notice? The words hit Naomi harder than any insult she'd ever endured. Because she had asked herself that same question more times than she could count. In rooms like this, in moments like this, when everyone was looking but nobody was seeing, she glanced toward the far corner of the room, where her manager stood, monitoring the service with hawkish attention. His eyes found hers immediately. He shook his head, a clear warning. Don't. Stay quiet. Do your job. But the silence at the table had changed. It was no longer the controlled, strategic silence of someone choosing their moment. It had become something else. Something heavier. Something that felt like resignation. The men mistook it for surrender. One leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone closing a deal, speaking slower now, more deliberately, as if to a child or someone who didn't speak the language well. Let's be very clear, he said, his hands spread on the table like he was laying claim to territory. This is a generous offer. More than generous. We're prepared to move forward tonight. Right now, all you need to do is sign, and this becomes real. Tomorrow, you'll wake up as part of something bigger than yourself. Naomi's hands trembled. The water pitcher felt impossibly heavy. She knew what this would cost her. Knew what speaking up would mean. The manager had already warned her twice this month about maintaining professional boundaries. Another infraction would mean termination. No references, no severance, just gone. And she needed this job. Needed the money for her mother's medical bills. Needed the health insurance. Needed the stability, however precarious. But she also knew what staying silent would cost someone else. Dr. Matsuda looked up, perhaps sensing the change in the room's energy. Her eyes swept across the space and landed, for just a second, on Naomi. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat, but that was enough. In that moment, Naomi saw everything. The exhaustion, the isolation, the weight of being powerful and still powerless to stop men from talking over you, around you, through you. She saw herself. Naomi took a step closer to the table. Then another. Her manager's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening in alarm. She didn't look at him. She looked at Drive, Matsuda, and she spoke, in Japanese, clear, respectful, but unmistakably strong. Sumimasen. Watashi wa kikisugi te shimata kamo shiremasen ga, sono keiyaku ni te suite, anata ga shidiru beki koto ga arimasu. Excuse me, I may have overheard too much, but there is something you should know about that contract. The room didn't just go quiet. It stopped. Everything stopped. The men's faces froze mid-expression. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Forks hung suspended in air. Even time itself seemed to hold its breath. The men stared at her with expressions that cycled rapidly through confusion, shock, and something darker. Something that looked like fear. Kenji turned sharply in his chair, his eyes wide. The manager took a step forward, his face flushing red. But Drive, Matsuda's expression changed completely. Not to shock, not to surprise, to recognition, to relief, to something that might have been hope. For the first time that entire evening, she was not being spoken for. She was being answered, she was being seen, and everything, absolutely everything, shifted. The room did not move. It didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't exist in any recognizable way for what felt like an eternity compressed into 3 seconds. No one laughed, no one spoke, no one even seemed to remember how. Naomi's words still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. The Japanese syllables lingered in the space between people, sharp and unexpected, like glass dropped on marble and somehow not breaking, just hovering there, defying gravity and expectation. For the first time that evening, the men were unsure. And men like this, men who built empires on certainty, who weaponized confidence the way generals deployed armies, did not know how to exist in uncertainty. One of them blinked, slowly, as if the action required conscious thought, as if he had to remind himself how. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Opened again. Did she just? His voice cracked on the last word. Another straightened in his chair, the leather creaking loudly in the terrible silence. His hand, which had been reaching casually for his wine glass, froze midair. That was Japanese. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. The third man's eyes darted between Naomi and Dr. Matsuda, his mind visibly working, recalculating, trying to understand how the equation had suddenly changed. How a variable he hadn't even known existed had just appeared and rendered all his previous calculations meaningless. Their carefully constructed power dynamic, the one they'd spent the entire evening building, brick by invisible brick, had just collapsed. And they felt it crumbling beneath them. Dr. Matsuda turned slowly in her chair. Not rushed, not dramatic, just a smooth, deliberate movement that suggested she had all the time in the world. Her dark eyes found Naomi's and held them. For 3 heartbeats, the two women simply looked at each other. And in that look, an entire conversation happened. Thank you. I see you. You're not alone. Then Drive. Matsuda spoke. Her voice was quiet but no longer constrained. No longer performing neutrality. There was something different in her tone now. Not anger, not triumph, but something more powerful than either. Clarity. She spoke in Japanese, her words flowing with the kind of precision that comes from someone who has spent years choosing their words carefully, who understands that language is architecture and every word is a load-bearing beam. Anata wa yuki ga aru. Sor wa mer na koto dezu. Watashi wa kikita masu. You have courage. That is rare. I want to hear what you have to say. Naomi felt her throat tighten. For 3 years, she had been invisible in rooms like this. For 3 years, she had served and cleared and existed as a function rather than a person. And now someone was asking to hear her. Not commanding, not demanding, asking. She glanced once more at her manager. His face had gone from red to purple, a vein throbbing visibly at his temple. His hand was already moving toward his phone, probably composing the termination paperwork in his mind. She had crossed a line, and they both knew it. But some lines, once you see them clearly, aren't meant to keep you in place. They're meant to be crossed. Naomi turned back to the table. She looked at the men, really looked at them for the first time, and saw what she'd suspected all along. They were afraid, not of her, specifically, but of what she represented. The loss of control, the disruption of their carefully scripted performance. The presence of a witness who understood not just the words but the meaning beneath them. She spoke again, in Japanese, addressing Drive. Matsuda directly. Sono keiyaku no naka ni, anata no kenri wo seigen suru joko ga. Fukumari taimasu. Karera wa sor wo. Hyojun, to yonda masu ga, Sor wa uso desu. That contract contains clauses that restrict your rights. They're calling it standard, but that's a lie. The translation hung in the air. One of the men laughed. It was a nervous sound, brittle and desperate, the kind of laugh that's really a defense mechanism. Well, that's quite impressive. Really, your language skills are irrelevant, Naomi said, switching to English. Her voice was steady. Is that the word you're looking for? He blinked. I didn't say. You were about to. The other men exchanged glances. Quick, darting looks that communicated volumes. They were regrouping, strategizing, trying to regain the upper hand. One of them, the one who'd been most dismissive all evening, leaned forward. His voice took on that particular tone of condescending patience that powerful men use when they want to remind you of your place. Look, he said, spreading his hands as if offering peace. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is a private business meeting. You're a waitress. You serve food. You're not qualified to interpret complex legal. I have a law degree, Naomi said quietly. The words landed like a bomb in a glass house. I graduated from Columbia, passed the bar in New York, worked for Morrison and Foster for 2 years before my mother got sick and I needed a job with flexible hours and immediate health insurance. She paused, letting that sink in. So yes, I'm qualified to interpret complex legal language. And I'm telling you, and more importantly, telling Drive Matsuda, that your standard contract is designed to strip her of control over her own intellectual property. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of shock. This was the silence of people realizing they'd been caught. Dr. Matsuda spoke again, in Japanese, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been satisfaction. Naomi translated. She says she would like to hear exactly which clauses concern me. Naomi stepped closer to the table. Her hands were still shaking, but she moved with purpose now. The fear was still there. Fear of losing her job, fear of the consequences, fear of speaking up in a world that punished women for having voices, but it was joined by something stronger. Conviction. She reached for the contract, her fingers hovering just above the cream-colored paper. May I? She asked. No one answered, but no one stopped her either. She turned to page 7. Her finger found the paragraph immediately. She'd been reading it upside down from across the room for the last 15 minutes. Here, she said, her voice growing stronger. Section 7, subsection C. Upon completion of acquisition, all rights to product development, licensing, and distribution revert to the acquiring entity, with the seller maintaining advisory capacity at the discretion of the board. She looked up at Drive Matsuda, speaking in Japanese. Kor wa, karera ga anata no koken wo motomaru hitsuyo ga nai koto wo imi shimasu. Karera wa anata wo heiho dekiru. So shite anata wa nani mo dekanai. This means they don't have to seek your input. They can exclude you, and you can do nothing about it. Dr. Matsuda's expression didn't change, but her hands, which had been folded calmly in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. She asked a question in Japanese, her tone sharp now, precise. Hoka ni wa, what else? Naomi flipped to page 12. Section 14, subsection A through F. Non-compete clauses. If you sign this, you cannot advise, consult, teach, or participate in any capacity in medical technology development for 10 years. Not just competing companies, any participation at all. She translated into Japanese, then continued in English, looking directly at the men. You're not buying her company. You're buying her silence. One man's face flushed. That's a gross mischaracterization, is it? Naomi cut him off. Then explain to me why a non-compete needs to extend to teaching and research. Explain why someone who builds life-saving technology needs to be prohibited from educating the next generation. That's protection, another man said quickly. Industry standard protection against. Against what? Naomi's voice rose slightly. Against her using her own knowledge. Against her contributing to her own field. Against her having a voice. Dr. Matsuda spoke again, in Japanese. Her words came slower now, weighted with something that sounded like exhaustion mixed with vindication. Naomi translated, and this time her voice carried the full emotion behind the words. She says you mistook her quiet for permission. Her silence for ignorance. Her patience for weakness. The man who'd been most dismissive slammed his hand on the table. The wine glasses jumped. Enough. This is absurd. We came here in good faith. No, doctor. Matsuda's voice cut through the room like a blade. She had switched to English. Perfect, unaccented, flawless English. You came here believing I would not understand. Believing I would not question. Believing my silence meant I could not speak. The room seemed to tilt. The men's faces went through a cascade of emotions. Shock, embarrassment, anger, fear, settling finally on something that looked like panic. You speak English. One stammered. I have a doctorate from MIT, Drive. Matsuda said calmly. I've lived in Boston for 12 years. I've given keynote speeches in English at medical conferences on 4 continents. So yes, I speak English. She paused, letting that settle. I chose to speak Japanese tonight because I wanted to see who you really are. I wanted to hear what you say when you think no one important is listening. Another pause, longer this time. And you showed me everything I needed to see. One man tried to recover. Dr. Matsuda, this is clearly, there's been a misunderstanding. There has been no misunderstanding, she said. Her voice was still quiet, still controlled, but there was steel in it now. You have been perfectly clear. You think I am someone to be managed, controlled, silenced. You think my company is something you can acquire and reshape in your image, removing me from my own creation while using my name to sell it. She stood slowly, gracefully, her movements deliberate. You were correct about one thing. This meeting is over. The men scrambled to their feet. Wait. Let's not be hasty. We can renegotiate terms. Doctor. Matsuda opened her handbag. A simple black leather bag that probably cost more than Naomi made in 6 months, and withdrew a small device. Sleek, metallic, about the size of a phone. She placed it on the table. The sound it made, a soft click against the wood, was deafening. What is that? One man asked, though the fear in his voice suggested he already knew. Doctor. Matsuda pressed a button on the device's surface. Voices filled the room. Their voices. From earlier in the evening, before she arrived. Going to be easy. She barely speaks English, from what I've heard. Asian women, they're so polite, so agreeable. Key is not to give her time to think. Keep pushing. Keep her off balance. Honestly, if she signs this, she deserves what she gets. Anyone stupid enough to build something valuable and then just hand it over. Laughter. Their laughter. The recording continued for 30 seconds. Every dismissive word, every assumption, every plan to manipulate her into surrender. Then silence. Doctor. Matsuda pressed the button again, stopping the playback. Japan has one-party consent laws for recordings, she said calmly. As does New York, where your company is based. This recording is completely legal. The color drained from their faces. You recorded us. One whispered. I recorded you conspiring to deceive me, she corrected. I recorded you discussing how to manipulate someone you believed could not understand you. I recorded you revealing that this entire meeting was theater designed to extract my signature on a contract you knew was exploitative. She picked up the device and returned it to her bag. I came here tonight because I was curious. I wanted to know if the rumors about your firm were true. If you really did target companies led by women, by immigrants, by anyone you perceived as vulnerable. If you really did use acquisition as a weapon disguised as opportunity. She looked at each of them in turn. You have confirmed everything. The door to the private dining room burst open. Naomi's manager stormed in, his face still purple with rage. You, he shouted, pointing at Naomi. You violated every protocol we have. You interfered with a private meeting. You spoke out of turn. You're fired. Effective immediately. Naomi felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She'd known this was coming, but knowing and experiencing are different things. 3 years of work, gone. Health insurance for her mother, gone. Stability, security, gone. She nodded slowly, already untying her apron. Actually, a new voice said from the doorway, calm and measured, she's not going anywhere. Everyone turned. A man stood in the entrance to the private dining room. Tall, perhaps 60, with silver hair and a suit that made the other men's expensive clothes look cheap by comparison. He moved into the room with the kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. I've been listening to this entire conversation, he said, his voice carrying easily across the space. Through the security feed, Dr. Matsuda requested I monitor the meeting remotely. He looked at Naomi's manager. This young woman just prevented your restaurant from being complicit in fraud. You should be thanking her, not firing her. The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The man turned to the three men at the table. I'm Robert Chen, senior partner at Chen & Associates. We represent Drive, Matsuda and Cairo Medical Technologies. Recognition flickered across their faces. Chen & Associates wasn't just a law firm. It was the law firm. The one that had taken down 3 Fortune 500 companies in the last 5 years alone. This meeting is over, Robert Chen said simply. Security will escort you out. And gentlemen, I would start consulting with your own lawyers soon. The men gathered their papers with trembling hands. Their earlier confidence had evaporated completely, leaving behind only the hollow shells of people who'd just realized they'd lost everything. As they filed out, escorted by security guards who'd appeared seemingly from nowhere, one of them looked back at Naomi. The expression on his face was pure hatred. She met his eyes and didn't look away. When the room was finally clear, just Naomi, Drive, Matsuda, Kenji, Robert Chen, and the purple-faced manager remaining, Drive. Matsuda turned to Naomi. She bowed, not a slight nod, but a full, formal bow. The kind that conveys deep respect. When she straightened, she spoke in Japanese. Anata ga nakariba, watashi wa onyo keiyaku ni shomei shitita kamo shiremasen. Anata wa watashi no keisha wo sukuda. Anata wa watashi wo sukuda. Without you, I might have signed that contract. You saved my company. You saved me. Naomi felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back. Dr. Matsuda continued, switching to English. I need someone on my team who has courage. Who sees injustice and speaks. Who understands both language and law. She paused. Would you consider working for Cairo? The manager spluttered. She's still employed here. She can't just. Robert Chen turned to him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Actually, you fired her. About 3 minutes ago. Remember? The manager's face went from purple to gray. Naomi looked at Drive, Matsuda, at this woman who had turned her silence into strategy, her patience into power. Yes, Naomi said. Yes, I would be honored to work for you. Dr. Matsuda smiled. It was the first genuine smile of the entire evening. Good, she said, because tomorrow, we have work to do. Those men aren't the only ones who underestimate quiet women. And I think it's time we started correcting that assumption. She extended her hand. Naomi took it. The handshake was firm, mutual, equal. Outside the windows, the city glittered in the darkness, 47 floors below. Millions of people going about their lives, unaware that in this room, something had shifted. Power hadn't just changed hands. It had been reclaimed. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the conference room table. Naomi stood at the head of that table, a tablet in her hand, presenting quarterly legal compliance metrics to a room full of executives who actually listened when she spoke. It still felt surreal sometimes. The weight of the expensive blazer on her shoulders, midnight blue, tailored, professional. The respectful silence that greeted her words instead of the invisible dismissal she'd grown so accustomed to. The business cards in her pocket that read, Naomi Clark, General Counsel, Cairo Medical Technologies. From invisible to indispensable in half a year. But the transformation hadn't been easy. And the cost had been higher than she'd imagined. The room had emptied slowly that night, 6 months ago. Security had escorted the 3 men out through a service elevator, a deliberate choice by Robert Chen. Let them see the back way, he'd said with that cold smile. Let them remember what it feels like to use the exits reserved for people no one wants to see. Naomi had stood in that private dining room, her untied apron still in her hands, watching her manager pace back and forth like a caged animal who'd just realized the cage door had been open all along. Do you have any idea what you've done? He'd hissed at her. Do you know who those men were? What kind of connections they have? Yes, Naomi had said quietly. I do. That's exactly why I spoke up. The manager had opened his mouth to respond, but Robert Chen had stepped forward, his presence filling the space in a way that made the manager suddenly look very small. "I suggest you leave now," Robert had said softly. "Before I decide to examine your employment practices more closely. I'm curious about how many other talented people you've convinced to stay invisible." The manager had left. Dr. Matsuda had turned to Naomi then, and the expression on her face was something Naomi would never forget. Not gratitude, that would have been too simple. It was recognition. The look of someone who'd been alone in a fight for so long that they'd forgotten what an ally looked like. "Come with me, Drive," Matsuda had said. "We need to talk." They'd left the Kensington Tower together, Drive, Matsuda, Kenji, Robert Chen, and Naomi, and had walked 3 blocks through the cool night air to a small, unremarkable cafe that stayed open late for night shift workers and insomniacs. "I hate those expensive restaurants, Drive," Matsuda had admitted, once they were seated in a booth with cracked vinyl seats and chipped coffee mugs. Too much performance, not enough truth. She'd ordered coffee, black, strong enough to strip paint. And then she'd told Naomi her story. "I was 19 when I came to America, Drive," Matsuda had said, her hands wrapped around the coffee mug like it was anchor keeping her tethered to the present. "Full scholarship to MIT. My parents were so proud. I was going to be an engineer. I was going to build things that mattered." She'd smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that carries the weight of years. "My first semester, I had a professor who would call on everyone in the class except me. When I raised my hand, he looked past me. When I submitted papers, he returned them with barely a grade and no comments. After 3 months, I asked why." Naomi had leaned forward, already knowing the answer, already feeling the familiar ache. "He told me I was taking a spot from a real American student. He said my English was too hard to understand. He suggested I consider a different major. Something less demanding." Dr. Matsuda had taken a sip of coffee, her eyes distant. "I went to the department head. Filed a complaint. Provided documentation. Do you know what they told me?" Naomi had shaken her head, even though she could guess. "They said I was culturally misinterpreting his teaching style. That perhaps American classroom dynamics were different from what I was used to. They suggested I was being too sensitive." The words had landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of recognition that spread through Naomi's own memories. "So I stopped speaking in class, Drive," Matsuda had continued. "I stopped asking questions. I stopped raising my hand. I made myself invisible. And you know what happened. Your grades improved," Naomi had whispered. "My grades improved. Because when I was silent, I wasn't a problem. I wasn't disrupting the learning environment. I wasn't making anyone uncomfortable with my presence." Dr. Matsuda had set down her coffee mug with careful precision. "I learned something important that year. Silence can be survival, but silence can also be strategy. Those men tonight, they thought my silence meant weakness. They never considered it might mean I was listening, learning, documenting." She'd pulled out that recording device again, turning it over in her hands. "I've been recording meetings like this for 5 years. 12 companies have approached me with acquisition offers. All of them had clauses designed to erase me from my own work. All of them assumed I wouldn't understand. All of them were wrong." Robert Chen had leaned back in his chair. "We've been building a case," he'd explained. "Not just against those 3 men, but against the pattern. The systematic targeting of companies led by women, by immigrants, by anyone these firms perceive as vulnerable. And tonight, Drive," Matsuda had said, looking directly at Naomi, "you gave us something we couldn't manufacture. A witness. Someone who saw it happening, understood what it meant, and had the courage to speak up despite knowing what it would cost." Naomi had felt tears threatening again. "I lost my job. You lost a job that required you to be invisible, Drive." Matsuda had corrected gently. "What I'm offering you is a position that requires you to be seen." The transition had been brutal. Naomi had called her mother that first night, standing on the sidewalk outside her apartment building at 2 a.m. because she was too wired to sleep. "Mama, I did something crazy today. Crazy good or crazy bad?" her mother had asked, her voice thick with sleep and medication. "I don't know yet. Maybe both." She'd explained everything. The meeting, the men, the Japanese, the recording, the job offer. Her mother had been quiet for a long moment. "Baby girl," she'd finally said, "you know what your grandmother used to tell me. She said there are two kinds of silence. There's the silence of fear, where you make yourself small to avoid being hurt. And there's the silence of power, where you're quiet because you're listening, learning, waiting for exactly the right moment to speak." Another pause. "Sounds like you found your moment." Starting at Cairo had meant stepping into a world Naomi hadn't prepared for. The legal department wasn't just her. There were 3 other attorneys, a paralegal, and an intern. They'd all been skeptical at first. She came from where? She'd overheard one of them asking Kenji. A restaurant. And now she's our general counsel. Naomi had proven herself the only way she knew how, by working harder than everyone else. By being smarter. By being so undeniably competent that doubt became impossible. She'd reviewed every contract, identified weaknesses in their intellectual property protections, restructured their licensing agreements. Within 6 weeks, she'd saved the company $2.3 million in potential litigation costs. The skepticism had faded, but not everywhere. The legal community was small, and word traveled fast. Those 3 men, Marcus Whitfield, David Chen, and Robert Patterson, had reputations. Power. Connections that ran deep through the industry like roots through soil. They'd been humiliated, and humiliated men with power are dangerous. 2 months after that night, Naomi had started receiving emails. Anonymous at first, then increasingly bold. "You ruined 3 good men's careers over a misunderstanding. You should have stayed in your place. Affirmative action hire thinks she's a lawyer. Go back to serving coffee." She'd shown them to Dr. Matsuda, expecting, she didn't know what. Sympathy. Protection. Dr. Matsuda had read through each one with an expression that never changed. "I get about 50 of these a week," she'd said calmly. "Have for years." She'd looked up at Naomi. "You spoke up. You disrupted their world. They want you to regret it. They want you to be afraid. They want you to disappear back into silence. Are you afraid?" Naomi had asked. Dr. Matsuda had smiled then, and it wasn't a sad smile anymore. "I'm terrified," she'd admitted. "Every single day. But fear and courage aren't opposites. Courage is being afraid and speaking anyway. Acting anyway. Existing anyway." She'd closed the laptop with the emails. "Don't let them make you small again. You're too important for that." 3 months after that night at the Kensington Tower, Robert Chen had filed a massive lawsuit. Not just against the 3 men, but against their entire firm, Meridian Capital Partners. The charges were extensive. Fraudulent acquisition practices, systematic discrimination, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violations of federal trade regulations. The evidence was devastating. 12 recordings from Dr. Matsuda's meetings over 5 years. Testimonies from other CEOs who'd been targeted. Financial records showing a pattern. And Naomi's eyewitness account, backed by the recording from that night, providing the final piece that made the case unassailable. The media had exploded. Billionaire CEO secretly recorded years of discriminatory acquisition attempts. How one waitress's courage exposed systemic fraud in private equity. The woman they underestimated. Drive. Yuki Matsuda's long game. Naomi's face had appeared in business magazines. On news websites. In interviews she never quite felt ready for. "How did you know what to do?" a journalist had asked her. "I didn't," Naomi had admitted. "I just knew what would happen if I did nothing. And I'd been doing nothing for too long." The lawsuit had settled 4 months later. The terms were confidential, but Naomi knew from Robert Chen that the amount was significant enough to fund our operations for the next decade without taking another outside dollar. More importantly, all 3 men had been forced to resign from Meridian Capital Partners. The firm itself was under federal investigation. And across the industry, acquisition contracts were being rewritten. Naomi finished her presentation and looked around the table. Dr. Matsuda nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, as always." The other executives murmured agreement. 6 months ago, Naomi had been invisible. Today, she was essential. But the victory came with complexity. After the meeting ended, Drive. Matsuda asked Naomi to stay behind. "I have something for you," she said, sliding a folder across the table. Naomi opened it. Inside was a legal document. "A partnership agreement. You're making me a partner." Naomi's voice cracked slightly. You were never just an employee, Drive. Matsuda said. That night, you became something more important. An ally, a colleague, someone who understood that the fight isn't just about one company or one contract. It's about changing the system that made that contract possible in the first place. She stood, walking to the windows that overlooked the city. Those men thought they could take everything because they assumed I couldn't fight back. They assumed my silence meant submission. They assumed my foreignness meant ignorance. They assumed their power made them untouchable. Doctor. Matsuda turned back to Naomi. You taught me something that night. Silence is powerful, yes. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is break the silence for someone who can't break it themselves. Naomi felt the weight of the folder in her hands. I didn't do it to be heroic, she said quietly. I did it because I was tired of being invisible. Tired of watching it happen to others. I know, Drive, Matsuda said. That's exactly why you're the right person for this partnership. Because you didn't speak up for recognition. You spoke up because it was right. Naomi stood in the lobby of the Kensington Tower, looking up at the building that had changed her life. She was here for a meeting, a real one this time, with a hospital system interested in partnering with Cairo to expand their diagnostic technology. As she walked toward the elevator, she passed the restaurant where she used to work. Through the glass, she could see waitstaff moving between tables. Invisible, essential, unacknowledged. She thought about going in, saying hello, but she knew how that would go. She knew how it felt when someone who'd made it out came back, their success an unintentional reminder of everything you were still trapped in. Instead, she stood there for a moment, remembering what it felt like to tie that apron, to move through rooms full of important people who never saw you, to carry the weight of invisibility like a second uniform. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Matsuda. Ready. Naomi typed back. Ready. As she rode the elevator up, not to the private dining room this time, but to an executive suite, she thought about her mother's words. Two kinds of silence. The silence of fear, and the silence of power. She'd lived in both. She'd learned from both. And she'd discovered that the real power wasn't in the silence itself. It was in knowing when to break it. The story didn't end that day in the conference room. It never really ends. 3 weeks after Naomi became a partner, a young woman reached out through LinkedIn. She was a research assistant at a tech company, had seen the news coverage, wanted to know, how did you find the courage? Naomi had replied, I didn't find it. I was just more afraid of staying silent than I was of speaking up. That young woman filed her own harassment complaint 2 weeks later. She won. A month after that, another message. Then another. Women who'd been underestimated, overlooked, spoken over, each one finding their voice because someone else had found theirs first. Dr. Matsuda and Naomi started a legal fund. Small, at first, designed to help people who couldn't afford to fight back when powerful people assumed they couldn't. They called it the Silent Number More Initiative. Within 6 months, they'd helped 17 people. Within a year, the number was over 100. And somewhere, in boardrooms and conference rooms and private dining rooms across the country, powerful people started to realize something important. Silence didn't mean what they thought it meant. It never had. Here's what you need to understand. This story isn't about one heroic moment. It's about the choice we make every single day. The choice to speak or stay silent. The choice to act or watch. The choice to see people as fully human or reduce them to the roles they're playing in our lives. Naomi didn't expose those men because she was brave. She exposed them because she was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of watching others be erased. Tired of a world that mistakes silence for permission. Dr. Matsuda didn't record those meetings because she was calculating. She recorded them because she'd learned, painfully, that when you're underestimated, documentation is survival. That night at the Kensington Tower didn't change the world. But it changed their world. And sometimes, that's where revolution begins. Not in grand gestures or perfect moments, but in the small, terrifying, necessary act of refusing to stay quiet when everything in you is screaming to stay safe. If this story moved you, I need you to do something. Don't just feel inspired. Don't just think, that was nice. Act. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories like this. Stories about real courage, real struggle, real change. Like this video to tell the algorithm that stories about invisible people matter. That stories about speaking truth to power deserve to be seen. And most importantly, comment below. Tell me, what silence have you been carrying that needs to be broken? Who in your life is being underestimated right now? What will you do differently after hearing this? Because here's the truth they don't want you to know. You are not invisible. You never were. They just convinced you that you were because your invisibility served their purpose. But your silence is your choice. And the moment you choose to break it, really break it, knowing what it might cost, that's when you stop being background noise in someone else's story. That's when you become the author of your own. Remember, people reveal who they are when they think you don't understand them. Never underestimate silence. Never underestimate those who seem invisible. Because the person pouring your water might be recording every word. The person you overlook might be the one who changes everything. And the moment you think you've won, that might be exactly when you've already lost. Thank you for reading this story. Thank you for seeing Naomi. Thank you for understanding that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is a quiet voice at the end of a long day saying, I see what's happening, and I won't let it continue. Until next time, stay visible. Stay heard, stay powerful. Silence is not weakness, it is observation. But knowing when to break that silence, that's wisdom. Stay tuned for our next videos.